Hi, this is Erica Wood from the Hopkins County Extension Office, and I'm back with another video. And today I'm going to talk to you about these plants right beside me, and they are known as Monstera deliciosa. Otherwise goes by the common name of Swiss cheese plant and Mexican breadfruit plant. Because actually when this plant is mature, it will produce a fruit that when completely ripe can be quite delicious, which is where its scientific name comes from. So with Monstera deliciosa, these come from tropical regions of Central America. And so whenever you are growing this as a house plant, you want to try to recreate those conditions in your home. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So with Monstera deliciosa, this is a plant that is going to thrive in a more humid environment. It can survive in low humidity, but the more humidity that you can give it in your house, the better. So maybe if you have a brightly lit bathroom or kitchen, which are more humid parts of the house, or maybe you can provide a humidifier, like if you have a bright sunroom, that's going to be ideal for this plant. So this plant is going to like bright indirect light, and actually more bright light you give it, probably the faster it's going to grow. It can survive in lower light conditions, but it may not be growing quite as fast for you, or may not produce kind of those nice big fenestrated leaves that you would like. And so with that, let's kind of talk about the leaves as to why it's even called the Swiss cheese plant. And so with Monstera, initially when it's immature, it produces kind of more of these cordate, kind of heart-shaped looking leaves. And as it matures and the more bright light you give it, and even whenever you're able to stake it well, it's going to, in time, kind of get more of these fenestrations where it almost looks like the leaves are kind of cut up on the sides, and sometimes you'll see even holes appear in some of the more mature specimens. So those are what we, like I said, what we call fenestrations. And so if you want those bigger, bolder leaves that have kind of more of those holes in them, first of all, one thing, you got to give it time. You got to give the plant time to mature. But also, like I said, kind of the brighter light conditions you give it, the faster it's going to grow, the happier it's going to be, and it might produce bigger leaves for you as a result. With this plant, when it comes to other conditions, you just want to make sure it's in well-drained soil, so a good kind of peat-based potting mix. I usually like to add a little bit more perlite in the mixture just to have a little bit better drainage. Also, when it comes to watering, you're going to water it when the soil really feels dry to the touch. So like if you put your pinky down in the soil and the first few inches feel pretty dry, then it's about time to water it, because you don't want to accidentally overwater it and then you get into issues like some kind of root rot disease. So you have to be mindful of that. When it comes to the overall growth pattern of this plant, so where this plant is naturally in its environment is it's going to be more of a climber. Pretty standard that this plant is going to climb up different trees, kind of along the trunk into the tree canopies. And so it's always a good idea, as this plant matures, the bigger it gets, that you would have some way to stake it, or even ideally put it on something like a moss pole. This is not like the most ideal pole setup, of course, but if you're committed and you want to get some kind of pole where you can put fresh kind of moss that you can moisten it, then the aerial roots that come off of this plant are really going to kind of set into that pole and become attached, and going to be just overall more ideal for that plant. These like to climb, and so you might get, even if you put it in an ideal way where you have a moss pole or you have a way of staking it, sometimes giving it those conditions can also kind of promote more leaves on it or bigger leaves on it in time too. So, I mean, you can choose to not stake this plant, but over time it is going to get kind of wild. It may flop over from kind of the weight. A lot of the aerial roots will try to kind of dig down into that soil a little bit. And then most of the time when you're buying like any of these monsteras, usually you get several plants that are planted together in one pot. So it might even get a little bit overcrowded. So just have a way to support the plant. So when it comes to other kinds of conditions, fertilizer, so it's just going to be using a standard balanced houseplant fertilizer of having a balance with your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels. And I would be just fertilizing, say, once a month during the growing season. So like from the spring into the fall. And then I wouldn't worry about fertilizing it come winter. Just like most plants traditionally in winter, their growth is going to slow down a little bit. When it comes to any kind of, diseases or pest issues, these are relatively easygoing plants. Like I said, they might be a little bit slower growing if you have them in lower light conditions. But overall, I mean, they're not too difficult when it comes to care. You may get things like, say, mealybugs potentially. Sometimes mealybugs might, especially if you have this plant outside and you're bringing it indoors in the winter, just kind of monitor and scout for pests because they could be along the leaves or the stems. Watch for mealybugs, watch for spider mites, things like that. And if you do see them, just kind of isolate the plant from the rest of your plants and then just, get them a good spray of something like insecticidal soap, and even just use a wet paper towel, just kind of wash off the bugs too. So just kind of be mindful of that. But generally, if the plant's healthy, gonna have little insect issues. Insects really thrive whenever a plant is stressed. When it comes to diseases, again, just with most houseplants, you just never want to overwater as to risk any kind of crown or root rot disease. Sometimes monsteras may get some kind of fungal or bacterial leaf spot on the foliage, and so you just have to watch that. Some ways to prevent that is to prevent like water droplets from kind of sitting on the leaves for a long period of time, because sometimes when water droplets do sit on the leaves for a long time, then that may promote disease development. So when you're watering, just make sure you're watering good, you're watering the soil and not all over the plant. Or if you keep this plant outside, just try to maybe avoid, if you can, direct contact where the water is going to kind of linger. And ideally, what you would want to do if you do keep it outside, like during the summer months here in Kentucky, you'll want to water in the morning, because then that'll give enough time for that water to evaporate and be less likely for disease development there. But other than that, Monstera is just a very easygoing, fun, beautiful houseplant. It's kind of no wonder that this is pretty much the poster child, if you will, of the houseplant industry. It seems like everyone has to have a Monstera. You see it on all kinds of marketing items, and there's a reason for that, because these will produce such gorgeous foliage, and it really gives that kind of tropical vibe in your home. So maybe one other thing I'll mention about this plant is you can get different cultivated varieties of Monstera. So we have our Monstera deliciosa, our main species, but you can get cultivated varieties off of that main species. Of course, you can get kind of more of a traditional solid green variety, but there are plenty, as I'm sure many of you are aware of variegated cultivars out on the market, such as things like Albo or Thai Constellation. And, you know, it's no wonder that those are also very popular, because on the leaves you get beautiful variegation. It could be anything from white to yellow variegation, where it could be speckling to almost like a whole half of a leaf is that color. Just one thing I'll just kind of note is, depending on the variegation, sometimes the variegated plants tend to be a little bit weaker than the actual solid green varieties, just because the solid green varieties are able to photosynthesize completely. If you have, say, a white variety where you've got half of the leaf is white, or even eventually like a whole leaf is white, it's not going to photosynthesize properly. And so it might create kind of a weaker plant. And so you may have to give it a little bit more care. You may want to give it brighter light conditions than you might traditionally do with the solid green, just to kind of help keep that variegation, but also just to help the plant along when it comes to being able to photosynthesize. So variegation is beautiful, and you can definitely grow variegated plants well in your home, but just keep in mind that they might need a little bit more care, and the plant just may not be quite as strong as its original solid green species. So I think that'll about do it for today. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.